Hello, everyone. Welcome to our briefing on preventing and managing COVID-19 in the workplace. This is Karen O'Hara. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications with WorkCare and your moderator for today's session. I know many of you joined us for our 52 consecutive weekly webinars and that you're aware that we've changed to a monthly schedule. So this is our first in a series of monthly briefings that will last for 1 hour. We previously were keeping the sessions to 40 minutes, 45 max, but since we're not meeting as frequently, we've extended the time so we can be sure to get all your questions answered. So welcome back if you're a regular attendee, and if this is the first time you're joining us, we're happy to have you. As always, the session is being recorded and you'll be on mute during the webinar. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. We post answers to all our questions on the website in writing within a couple days, and we also post the webinar recording on our YouTube channel, and during the session we'll post links to both of those resources. Our speaker is Anthony Harris, MD, MBA, MPH. Dr. Harris is board certified in occupational medicine. He's WorkCare's Chief Innovation Officer and Associate Medical Director for on-site clinical operations. He's also our lead clinician for WorkCare's COVID-19 response. Dr. Harris just recently returned from a trip to Guyana, and I'm hoping he might provide a little update about his experience there if there's time. And so I'm going to turn it over to him because we have a lot to catch up on in this past month. We've missed seeing you all. So I'm going to put myself on mute and turn it over to him. Thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for now our monthly updates regarding COVID. We've rebranded this series. We're calling it Trending Beyond COVID because we want to do a little shift from what we have been talking about for the last 52 weeks before this. And we want to focus in on what are the important trends that we need to know about that's happening now, that's going to happen throughout the year, that we know will likely impact our workforce. And we need to come up with solutions, be creative, and help keep our population safe. The other topic items that we historically have talked about, I believe most of you, if not all of you, have become accustomed to digesting that information more routinely, right? We've gotten in the swing of this COVID pandemic, so to speak, and digesting the CDC updates has become pretty routine for most of our participants. Understanding some of the numbers from an epidemiology standpoint, still very important, and we'll do that during this presentation as well, but we won't spend as much time on those epidemiology numbers because, again, most have become accustomed at understanding and digesting these numbers. What we are going to spend our time on moving forward month to month is really highlighting the trends that are important for us as practitioners on the front lines with protecting our workforce, and some of the things that we may not hear about more prominently in the media, because again, it's the unknown knowns and the unknown unknowns, if I'm going back to Donald Rumsfeld from back decades ago in his phraseology, that will affect our workforce and we need to be prepared for it. So without further ado, we'll jump into contrasting what we're doing now with what we've done before. Previously, we focused in on clinical updates, the microbiology and pathology. We looked at the epidemiology in detail, both in the US and abroad. We talked about prevention and some of the strategies that we recommend specifically from WorkCare with regard to keeping the workforce safe. So we're not diverging completely from the content from old. We're repackaging it, and we're going to focus in on some nuanced way to consume this data. And it's going to look like this. And so we're going to talk about trends, again, focusing on that as a primary anchor for our presentation. We'll begin with a clinical business case, right? What clinical trends are going to impact the workers in your business throughout this year and as we continue to deal with COVID-19? Then we'll dig into the causal examination behind that trend. What's driving that trend? Let's do a deep dive on it so that we understand and can articulate that to our workforce as necessary. Then we'll look to the thought leadership, primarily in the US, but also on occasion abroad, in regards to what to expect throughout this year and years to come as we deal with COVID-19. And we'll speak to, moving back up to the top right here, a quick picture of the numbers from an epidemiology standpoint of how we're dealing with COVID in the US, but primarily globally. We know that the global impact regarding COVID-19 requires a global approach for herd immunity. We'll get more into that on subsequent talks, but we'll always look at the numbers so that we understand a snapshot of where we're at. Then we'll get into the mechanics of the fix, we call it, right? We want to understand what and how really we're going to implement a solution to help mitigate impact to your workforce and to your business of the trend that we're highlighting month to month. And then finally, the messaging, right? How do we communicate to employees with best practices so that they not only receive the information, but implement the solution? Obviously, that is where the rubber meets the road and important as we talk about getting on the other side of this pandemic. So without further ado, we'll jump into number one, the clinical business case. And in this regard, we're talking today about required workplace vaccination. And I know, you're saying, Dr. Harris, that you're jumping into a hot button topic, right? Right off the bat. And that's what we do. That's what we're here for. And that's what we're going to make the clinical business case around today. So how do we keep the workforce safe in moving forward throughout the year? Requiring COVID-19 vaccinations may be something and is something we're seeing trending a bit already, and obviously a lot of discussion around it. So if we look at some of and try to understand some of the reasons behind a requirement will need to be in place throughout the year, the first thing that comes to mind is reinfection, right? And you're saying, hey, doc, I know the numbers. We've seen the numbers. Reinfection doesn't really happen. If we look at the global tracker for reinfections, we've seen this data before. There are only 66 cases really being reported globally, right? Obviously, that's a very low number. If we look at suspected cases, it's significantly higher. But again, when we look at global cases, still a very low number. And so you're asking yourself, so why are we talking about reinfection and why are we concerned about it whatsoever? And again, this is the business case we're going to make, the clinical business case we're going to make here today. So when we look at what is already being said about how we arrive at reinfection rates in the US in particular, we're seeing already a focus on underestimating the reinfections because we're not tracking it, okay? And if we look at what experts are opining about, it's multiple instances in which we know that the US is not built for tracking. As in this example, we have in this country not a strong system from a federal and from a state perspective to count and actually do surveillance of individuals who have been reinfected for COVID-19. And so in particular, we're talking about a need to actually not do surveillance in regards to what we're talking about before with general surveillance of testing. We're talking more specifically genetic sequencing after a test is conducted. And the crux of it right now in the US is that there are only a few labs that are doing full genetic testing of the cases that are coming positive in their particular labs. And so the data is very sparse, and we're just not looking for reinfections at a significant level to detect it, all right? And we'll talk about in cases in which there were a higher level of, this was ex-US, but higher level of the detection of reinfection potentially, we see a higher number of cases of reinfection. All right. And so as we talk about the causal, move on to the causal examination of reinfection, something that we've talked about briefly before, but we'll get more into a little bit more into reiterating this. It really comes down to evasion of natural immunity, right? That the SARS-CoV-2 variant may evade natural immunity, being specifically if you've been infected and recovered from COVID-19, the opportunity for reinfection, not just from the perspective of waning immunity, right? But also from the perspective of the mutation or the variant itself evading the immune system. And if we look at this, we've seen this publicized frequently in the media that some of the mutations, the variants can evade the killer T cells as well as the B cell production of antibodies. And if we look specifically at what drives that, we know it's the spike protein mutations. That's what's articulated here in this picture. On the left-hand side here, the little red proteins emanating from the virus, the viron itself, is basically what gets mutated. We're not going to get too nitty-gritty and nerd out too much here on the specific mutations, but we want to represent, though, that we have seen multiple mutations of the spike protein, multiple variants that are circulating not just in the US, but globally. And we know these variants do have several features that cause them to evade the immune system. Particularly, we'll talk about the Brazilian variant, P1 variant, in slides to come here. One of the things we want to talk about in this moment too that undergirds the need for a global approach to herd immunity is the necessity for other nations to participate in vaccinations of their citizens so that we don't import more of these variants. Right? For example, in Canada right now, very difficult to get the vaccine, right? And we've seen that across the board in Canada in general. So if we succeed in the US downstream from now in the summer and the fall at reaching a herd immunity, theoretically, at around 80% of the population, we still may inherit and import these type of variants from other nations that have not been as successful at vaccinating their population and are still experiencing mutations of the coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. This is exemplified in Australia, where most of their cases are very low in regards to native cases, and the cases that have been occurring recently are primarily importation of cases from abroad, right? And so it's not until we have a global herd immunity that we're going to be able to kind of raise this flag of success around our ability to travel and commute internationally without a greater risk of importing these type of variants, right? And again, we're going back to this is all undergirding why requiring vaccines in the workplace may be required in order to get us to a level of protection that we are all hoping for moving forward. Jumping to the thought leadership now. What are leaders saying? What is some of the research around the vulnerability to reinfection? So this is, again, going a little deeper beyond just the speculation, starting to look at actual data around reinfections, and this being a strong use case for vaccinations of a population. So we're going to turn to the Lancet. This study was published back in January of this year, and it looks specifically at a population in Brazil, Manaus, Brazil, okay? And as we dig into this study that examined this particular population, we can begin to understand what may be happening already in the US as we talk about spikes in our COVID cases. So let's get into this study. So this study is all about resurgence of COVID-19 in this city in Brazil, Manaus, Brazil, with historically a high seroprevalence. just to pause right there, recall that seroprevalence is the study looking at the general population, in particular, this case, as was in the US, blood, those individuals who donated blood, their blood was looked at for antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, right? And what we saw in Manaus, Brazil, was that up to 76% of those who donated for other reasons had a history of infection of SARS-CoV-2. This was back in by October of last year, right? And so again, simplistically put, up to 76% of the population contracted and recovered from SARS-CoV-2 or from COVID-19. If we look at then the attack rate, that's that essentially a proxy for the R naught number, right? The R naught number was 3, meaning that for every one infection, historically, 3 people were infected by that individual, right? And so that attack rate, as we talked about last year, when we talk about an R naught number, that helps predict what an estimated theoretical herd immunity number would be. In this case, 67% of the population, right? So at 76% of those who came back seropositive for infections of SARS-CoV-2, this population, in theory, should have reached herd immunity and should be not susceptible to SARS-CoV-2 based on these numbers, right? So let's continue in this study of what actually happened, right? So what we see is that the population had a resurgence, a clear resurgence of SARS-CoV-2, and we'll look at the chart of what that means. Actually, let's jump to that. I'm going to break format here just so we can jump to that and start to digest it, and then we'll go back and talk about some of the causes, potential causes of this. So let's look at specifically the trend that happened in Manaus, Brazil, okay? And the trend began back last year. I'm going to use my laser pointer here. As the numbers began to decrease, again, they had a spike kind of along with everyone else, right? When I talk about multinational spikes, we experienced the same or similarly. March of last year, we had began to have high cases of COVID building, right? Same thing here in Brazil, and those cases peaked and then began to decrease, particularly after mandatory masks were put in place and mandatory social physical distancing, right? So during this period, their rates of infection decreased and remained low, again, lining up with that 76% or that theoretical herd immunity period of time, right? And so because their case rate were low, the dark line here, the red, represents hospitalizations, the blue represents excess deaths. If we jump down to the second chart here, we can see the earliest detection of SARS-CoV-2 and the R naught number, right? This represents the R naught number. So their case rates were low, below 1, meaning that transmissions weren't happening readily. And during this period, they relaxed or eased the physical distancing, right? And as they did, rates stayed low. However, we have the earliest detection now of the P1 lineage, which is the Brazilian variant. And we see during this earliest detection here at the end of last year, a spike, not just in the R naught number that you see here above 1 and climbing, but also in the hospitalizations and the excess deaths. Second lockdown in Manaus, Brazil ensued thereafter to try to cull the increased rates of transmission they were seeing. Okay, so this is a clear case of a resurgence in a population estimated to be above herd immunity, right? Having recovered from 76% recovered from SARS-CoV-2. Right, so let's jump back to why this may have occurred. Okay, and if we look at and begin to examine that, we can see that I'm going to get rid of my laser pen here. We can see there are 4 potential causes and explanations for this resurgence. And we need to understand all 4 here succinctly so that we can, again, understand this trend that may be happening here in the US and make appropriate decisions to get ahead of this trend from potentially spiking and keeping our workforce safe. So the first is that perhaps this 76 number estimated seropositivity was overestimated, right? Biased up because of the need to account for the waning of antibodies or immunity that we all experience and that we've seen after an infection of SARS-CoV-2. We know that about 3 to 6 months after an infection of COVID-19 and you recover, your antibodies start to decrease. We showed that in detail last year during this presentation. So that may have happened here and was adjusted for, right, likely, but maybe that adjustment was too high and that these individuals weren't 76%, but perhaps lower, around 52 or even 60%. Nonetheless, that number still, at a rate of almost 60%, would be greater than what would be expected to prevent a resurgence like we saw, right? Secondly, the second thing that could have happened in regards to why we see this resurgence is and the immunity of these individuals waned and decreased to the extent where they all became an infection or susceptible to infection again, right? And again, 6 months after infection, primary infection, individuals can be more likely to contract and transmit COVID-19 again or SARS-CoV-2 again. In this case, though, the majority of the infections occurred in 7 to 8 months before the resurgence, right? And so because that cutoff there was not a greater length of time or gap, right? 6 months versus 7 to 8 months of the phenomenon, it's still not likely that this suggests waning immunity alone fully explained the resurgence, the dramatic resurgence that they saw in Manaus, Brazil. Thirdly, the third outcome or potential cause of this outcome is that the lineages of SARS-CoV-2, P1, the Brazilian variant, right, evaded the immunity. And we know that additional studies have examined this and have seen similar phenomenon of evasion of immunity. And then last, fourthly, the lineages of the second wave, right, had a much higher rate of transmissibility. And we see this the likeliness of this being, something that is not too uncommon for these variants that have surfaced in the US, particularly the UK variant and the South African variant, right? We know that these mutations of the spike protein causes them to be more, have a higher transmissibility, and P1 variant shares independently acquired mutations similar to the UK and South African variant, all right? So we have 4 causes of this particular trend that has happened in Brazil. And we'll talk about why still, even if all 4 of these were plausible, right, and may have caused the outcome, why vaccination is still the response from a protectionism standpoint of our workforce. So let's talk about some numbers real quick, how we're doing globally so that we can see, are we spiking truly? Are we trending up in the US truly? And how are we doing with vaccinations as well? So jumping into our epidemiology, familiar chart to you. We're not going to change this up because we know it's important to get a snapshot of where we're at, right? So daily new confirmed cases on a 7-day rolling average per million in the US. We see an upward trend over the last couple of weeks here, right? And so we'll continue to watch this, but we know individual states are experiencing these spikes in particular cities, such as Chicago, where I'm located, that this past week considering another lockdown because of increased rates of transmission. If we look at estimated effective reproduction rate, that R naught number, we can see how the US is doing here, and our R naught number over the last couple of weeks here trending upward. Again, transmissions above 1, meaning that we're experiencing a potential for a greater spike here in the coming weeks. If we look at daily new tests so that we can understand how we're actually articulating the burden of illness and the trend in the US, our number of tests are dramatically down from what we've seen earlier this year and obviously late last year compared to the UK, India, and some other of our neighbors across the pond here. So we're below 1 million tests on a daily average here. When we talk about positivity rate of these tests, obviously this trend is very telling in regards to, are we heading in the right direction or the wrong direction for a potential spike here? This number trending upward, not good, or excuse me, this number trending upward, yes, not good. This number trending downward is what we want to see. We are clearly trending upward, right? In regards to the positive percentage of cases. And so we know, again, that what we're seeing and hearing state to state is validated in the numbers across the board with regard to potential increased spikes here. Compared to India, we recall that India was above us in the per capita at this point for cases, and we see them also have been trending up for a greater period than we have been. Again, contrasting the R naught number with what's being experienced from a total case on a 7-day rolling average. If we look at the tests per 1,000 individuals, UK still trumping us by far in regards to more accurately articulating the burden of illness there compared to the US here, down at that 2.5 roughly. And then daily vaccine doses administered, how are we doing there? Obviously, per 100 people, we're doing okay compared to our neighbors across the pond. And this number is continuing to trend upwards, thankfully. Mass vaccinations are happening successfully in large cities, and that will likely continue because demand is being met by supply at this point, primarily not for the J&J, but primarily for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. And then if we look at vaccine doses administered, again, on a daily basis, we're doing 3 million. Just this week had crested the 3 million mark in one day for vaccine administration here in the US. If we look at that number from fully vaccinated, we're well over 60 million at this point, and we're continuing to see this upward trend. Obviously, good news in regards to hopefully reaching herd immunity as we hope to see by this fall. So now we're talking about the mechanics of the fix, right? The effectiveness and the lawfulness of required vaccines. Are the mechanics of it the mechanics of it make sense? And I apologize for the typo there, and something must have got cut out there. So if we look at the effectiveness of the vaccines, and this is an update, right? This is CDC publication as of April 2nd. We're seeing play out in situ, so to speak, right, in real world settings, what we've seen play out in the phase 3 clinical trials, that primarily for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, which are the mRNA vaccines, we're seeing not only decreased risk of infection, right, in regards to COVID-19 contracting and being susceptible, but we're seeing decreased risk of transmissions as well. So there was, talk around, hey, we get the vaccine, we can still catch COVID and we still can transmit COVID, right? And this study, this update, actually shows that the risk of contracting COVID-19 after vaccination is low. The risk of transmitting COVID-19 is also low. Specifically, it's low in regards to protecting up to 90% of people, up to 90% of the people after the second dose of the mRNA vaccine in a real world setting, as well as after the first dose, the number is holding up compared to the phase 3 clinical study of 80% protection rate, right? And so that's good news. Obviously, we want to communicate that to employees, to the general population, that what we're seeing in real life is what we saw in phase 3 clinical studies, and it's very compelling. In addition to protecting you from your native SARS-CoV-2, we're seeing this data hold up against the variants as well, right? And so that is the real undergirding of why the vaccine pathway is going to be our best bet, and requiring it to get the numbers where we need it to be for our workforce. Again, just having contracted and recovered from SARS-CoV-2 is likely not going to protect enough people to protect the workforce transmissions from happening in what we're seeing play out today in various states. If we talk about the legalities of requirements, there's still some gray area, admittedly, right? By far, by far and away, one of the leading experts on this topic. This is Professor Anna Santos Rushman. She is at St. Louis University. I actually spoke with her this week. She has been an advisor to the Biden administration on the COVID approach from early on in the administration. And she clearly keeps it simple. And the answer to whether or not it's legal and lawful to require a vaccine in the workplace is yes, right? What the nuance may be in regards to her interpretation or opinion of that legal requirement is whether or not FDA considers the emergency use authorization equivalent to a full authorization. So there may be some nuance that comes from a determination or ruling in that regard. But at this point in time, it's clear that employers are empowered to require the vaccine for their workforce to keep them safe. Obviously, we see that play out at some universities, and we see the opposite trend happening as well, right? Rutgers University requiring, and other universities, and other governors, such as in Florida, completely banning the ability of restaurants and proprietors, as well as any universities, from requiring a vaccine approach. So we'll continue to watch the trends around the U.S. Of what politically plays out, but also what plays out from a practical standpoint of our employers that not only WorkCare works with, but also the employers that have been leading in the charge to help get us back to normal as soon as possible. So the message to our employees is straightforward. Number one, right, confidence is key. So the vaccines are safe is the leading number one message, right? And then secondly, natural immunity is not going to cut it. It's not effective against, it's not as effective as the vaccine. And we now know why, obviously, and have the data to show that we can see spikes after a natural immunity has been conferred in populations. And then finally, vaccines get everyone back to normal. Everybody is tired of COVID. We know this, COVID fatigue, but getting back to normal safely and sooner is possible if we have populations vaccinated. And we want to start this message as soon as possible. If you haven't checked out CDC's body of work in regards to the messaging to your employees, they have quite a bit of information available to you, some of it plug and play, in regards to building your campaign on COVID-19 vaccinations. And the information there, being very rich, also goes into detail on safety, detail on efficaciousness of the vaccines. So we encourage you to, if you haven't started your messaging, or if you need assistance with messaging, leverage our expertise to help you do that. We even started a campaign to help bolster support for vaccinations in the workplace through live video. We call it a lunch and learn, and we also have pre-recorded specific messaging to your employees. We call it learn from an expert, right? And it's worked really well with over 100,000 employee populations with some of our partners already on a global basis. And we encourage the right messaging at the right time. The time is now, so that your workforce is participating. And hopefully, if you are to the point where you're going to require the vaccine, they're receptive, right? And there will be pushback. We know this. But at the end of the day, we know that the spikes we're seeing may be an early indication that we have variants causing these infections, even with the natural immunity that is imparted from people who have recovered. Recall, and this is, I'm kind of going off track here, hopefully we have enough time, but I want you to recall some of the points that we made previously last year on seropositivity in the US, right? We saw states with seropositivity high as 22%, right? Meaning that 22% of the populace in that particular state had already contracted and recovered from COVID-19, the native type, the wild type, back last year. And so what we may be experiencing now, again, is the same phenomenon that was experienced in Manaus, Brazil. And again, the vaccine can help prevent that from happening. So with that being said, we'll wrap it up for today. We'll ask some questions and we'll prepare for next month's talk, because we're going to get even deeper into some of these trends and help you really digest what the rest of this year is going to look like. So thank you, and we'll open it up to questions.
Thanks, Dr. Harris. I like the new look you have for your PowerPoint. Great. A lot of people are asking about the duration of immunity afforded by the 3 vaccines that are available in the United States and how they compare. The most recent information I heard was that it was about 8 months. But could you talk about each of the 3 products, Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J specifically, and how long the immunity we expect to extend for those 3?
Absolutely. So we know that antibodies produced, so there's a couple points here to answer this question, right? So in regards to the strength of immunity, or how much of an immunity is built up from these vaccines, particularly the Moderna, the Pfizer, and also the J&J, we know that the immune response compared to the native response from contracting and recovering from COVID is up to 40 times greater, right? Simplistically put, you develop 40 times greater number of antibodies if you get vaccinated compared to contracting COVID by itself, right? And so that's the first point. The second point is, if we look at and examine the longevity of these antibodies, particularly the longevity of also the memory B cells, and we presented this previously, we know that those antibodies circulating do wane after about 3 to 6 months, right? And we know that the B cells will linger for up to 8 months, we've seen so far. So what is the prevailing wisdom right now and recommendation? It's landing at 6 months. Early on, we said after 90 days, individuals may become susceptible again to infection after vaccination. Obviously, that increased now to 6 months. It may increase in terms of recommendations to 8 months as we learn more, but right now we're landing in around 6 months of immunity. So what does that mean for these 3 vaccines, the J&J, the Pfizer, and the Moderna? That means we may all need a booster in as soon as 6 to 8 months after your initial series of the vaccine. So Pfizer is conducting a basically a phase 1 clinical study on a booster approach, right? So they've been re-enrolled the participants from their initial phase 1 study. I spoke with one of the cardiologists in California who participated recently in this new 3rd booster shot study, and that data is pending, right? In regards to 1, is it safe? And then 2, what is the impact from a immunohistochemical standpoint? Meaning, does a booster increase the longevity of an immune response beyond the first series of the doses? So as we move forward here over the next weeks to months and get that, or able to examine that data from that study, particularly with Pfizer, that will be very telling in regards to whether or not a recommendation will pursue after that of getting a booster for everyone. So more to come, and certainly that's going to be a topic we talk about in this setting.
Yeah, there's a question related to that, which we probably will address later, but if someone got vaccinated early and their immunity period expires, we presume, and there's no booster, would you recommend that the employer start quarantining people again if they have an exposure?
So yes, the recommendation right now is essentially 90 days still after your vaccination. If you have a positive exposure, you may need to quarantine at that point. Is it across the board? You have to quarantine. No, it's rather a case-by-case determination, as we used to do for specific exposures to determine the severity of exposure and determine the susceptibility of the individual. But the recommendation of 90 days is still persistent, and that is where we are with regard to the clinical wisdom and formal clinical wisdom and recommendation so far.
Okay, and similarly, we've had this question before, but it's worth reiterating. If an employee experiences symptoms 1 to 3 days after vaccination, should they self-report and/or self-quarantine?
Say that one more time so make sure I understand it accurately.
Post-vaccination, if somebody has symptoms from the shot, what's your recommendation for handling those types of symptoms?
Sure, it is currently still a case-by-case determination, because we have seen individuals who were vaccinated who later, meaning 2, 3, 4 days later, become positive for COVID-19, right? And so with that being said, it needs to be a still case-by-case determination of did you contract, unfortunately, COVID-19 before your initial series of your vaccine? Now, if it's your second shot and you become symptomatic, if you're doing Moderna or Pfizer, then that's a much lower risk scenario, still warranted a individual review case by case, but again, much more likely to be a response to the immune system to the vaccine itself versus a scenario of having contracted COVID-19.
And a couple questions specific to the J&J vaccine. The first question is, does it contain the variants or antibodies to the variants? And the second question is, are there any studies yet that compare the effectiveness of J&J as opposed to Moderna and Pfizer vaccinations?
Yes, there is studies that have been conducted with the J&J vaccine against the UK and the South African variants, and J&J did show efficacy, not to the same level as against the wild type, where J&J is 70% effective, so slightly lower against the variants, but still effectiveness against those two variants that was studied. There needs to be obviously additional study against the Brazilian variant, the P1 variant, but certainly that should be forthcoming.
Okay, here's an interesting scenario that just came up today. One of our participants says, I just got an employee today who tested positive incidentally during a pre-op test 3 days after getting his second vaccination. His first one was 21 days ago. What's the likelihood that he's contagious?
Low likelihood, and that scenario in particular may have involved an infection that happened prior to his initial vaccine administration, and he persisted to have a positive response from a testing standpoint, which we know happens, it's 1 out of 5 individuals can test positive for prolonged periods of time, 3 months thereafter, and that's likely the case in this with the information you've given me, that he was infected, was positive, got his vaccination, was either asymptomatic or had little symptoms, so never suspected he was positive to begin with, and was still persistently positive even after his second vaccine administration. So the
Huh.
likelihood of him actually
Interesting.
being susceptible or being able to transmit COVID in that scenario would be low. Why? Because he's 10 days out from his initial likely positive response, because that would have preceded his 21-day period in which he received his first administration.
Huh. Okay. What do you think the likelihood of combined COVID and flu vaccine is for this upcoming flu season? What kind of progress has been made with the combo vaccine?
Likely to see the combo vaccine, right? And at this point, I believe all, both Moderna, Pfizer, and J&J are examining that combination, and that's just purely, for the convenience and protection that a combo would provide us. So I don't have any particular data on safety or efficaciousness of that combination yet. Obviously, that data should be forthcoming. There is also, on a side, a study still ongoing that combined, this is in the UK, combined the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines in series. So initial dose from one, second dose from the other, and whether or not that provides same level or similar level of efficaciousness as having the same dose, two doses of the same vaccine.
And a related question just popped up. If a person gets the initial vaccine this year, should they also get a combo vaccine later this year if it becomes available?
So the answer, wait, say that one more time. My audio cut out.
Say they got vaccinated for COVID already, and then they're offered a chance to get a COVID/flu vaccine. Should they get it too?
So yes, if we eventually recommend a booster, in that scenario, the answer is clearly yes, if the timing is appropriate. And so, yeah, if you have an opportunity and we recommend a booster, getting a combo would not be a problem. As far as we know, if the data comes out in regards to safety and efficaciousness of a combo vaccination. And just to correct something I said earlier, it was the South African and the Brazilian variant that was studied with J&J. And the efficacy was about 72% overall, or 66% overall, for the in the U.S. in general, 64% for the South African and 61% for the Brazilian variant. Again, going back to the question on the efficacy of the J&J vaccine and the two variants that were studied. I believe I said the UK and the South African. It was the South African and the Brazilian variant studied in that particular case.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. How many days after I get vaccinated can I go back to my quote unquote normal life?
14 days is the general rule of thumb in regards to how long it takes your immune system to respond appropriately, which is called seroconversion, and have enough conferred immunity from the vaccine to quote unquote go back to normal life, right? So right now the recommendation in the US is still, wear your mask when you're out in public, still practice the social distancing and the good hand hygiene, et cetera, cough hygiene, et cetera. And if you're in a setting of the home, then yes, absolutely have your friends over if they've been vaccinated. No one needs to wear a mask in that scenario if provided the people in that setting have all received their full series of vaccine doses.
Hey, and we have a few more minutes left. What's your opinion about the use of what they're calling vaccine passports? It seems a little controversial right now.
Well, yes. So that is the topic for next month. So I love the fact that we're asking the question already. We are intimately involved with that process and have solutions for vaccine passports that we're rolling out at WorkCare to help with a return to normal as soon as possible for those individuals that have been vaccinated. So more to come on that. I won't steal my own thunder in fully articulating our stance and updates on that topic. Stay tuned to next month here to really understand where things stand. But there's a tremendous amount of effort, a tremendous amount of focus on that, and it's highly politicized. So that'll be a little teaser, and we'll talk about the best practice approach from a standpoint of, is it even recommended to track vaccines in that fashion, and what are the pitfalls thereof to do so. So I'm happy that came up as a topic.
Me too, because we're working on something in marketing and communications to collaborate with what you're working on your end. So we've started doing some research as well. So we'll have a lot more in a month. So I just want to remind everybody, we'll be back on May 5th, same time, same place. If you have any questions or you want to learn more about the Lunch and Learn or the videos, just contact us at info@workcare.com, and you can find all our resources related to COVID and other topics on our website. And that concludes our session today because we have no more questions. Dr. Harris,
Excellent.
do you have anything else you want to add? You want to tell us a little bit about your trip?
Sure. Briefly, I'll provide that during the next talk here, just in the interest of time. But we had a great opportunity to collaborate with Guyana, which is in South America, and we'll give some success. It was a successful trip. They are slated to go from the third poorest country in the Western Hemisphere to the next Dubai, one of the wealthiest countries in the nation, as a result of having the largest oil deposit ever found. They refer to it as El Dorado, and it's about 9 billion barrels. So we will be moving forward with them to help keep their workforce safe, as they have obviously a swell of activity, economic development, and a swell of risk from a development standpoint as well, and injury management, et cetera. So we'll show some reels from that for the next month's talk here.
Looking forward to that. And one last question slip in, which I really would like to ask because I think it's important. Regarding vaccine resistance, some people are still concerned about the overall safety of COVID vaccines. Some say it's because it was rushed into production, but there's other reasons too. In your opinion, what is the most appropriate response?
Sure. So all the data that we have now, even as recent as the 1st of this month, Pfizer and Moderna both coming out and saying that they see still no indication of safety risks, even 6 months following full second dosage of a significant number of people in their phase 3 clinical studies, right? So we have enough time that has lapsed for individuals to show that there are no interim long-term effects, right? So we're talking the immediate effects being low. We spoke to the risk of anaphylaxis being low and other immediate responses being low. We also now have data around the interim effects being low. Still yet, we'll get data from 1 year out from the vaccine, right? But again, out of the tens of millions of people and globally hundreds of millions of people that have been vaccinated, safety has been holding up commensurate with what we've seen in the phase 1 clinical studies. Low risk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris. As always, we really appreciate all the information and research that you do on our behalf. A lot of people are writing in the chat, also expressing their appreciation. So we'll see you all in 1 month, the first Wednesday of the month. Mark your calendars and we'll send you reminders. Thanks again. It's great seeing you all back.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. And as always, stay safe and God bless.